Hello and welcome to episode 89 of On Liberty, coming to you live from the Centre for Independent Studies in Sydney, Australia. I'm your host, Salvatore Babonis, and joining me today is Mihai Sora, Project Director of the Australia PNG Network at Sydney's Lowy Institute. At Sydney's Lowy Institute. Mihai argues that Australia's financial aid program in the Pacific has not delivered the hoped-for influence, and that Australia must stop viewing the Pacific as its own neighborhood to fix. Mihai Sora, how are you?
Hi, Salvatore. Real pleasure to be here today.
All right. Well, sorry for flubbing the introduction. I'll try to make it up to you. Let me start out with, is China's Solomon Island deal really so important? We keep hearing about it in the news and how it's a tragedy, a travesty for Australia, but does it really matter that much?
The China Solomons security deal is a real wake-up call for the status quo in the region, the strategic status quo, if you will, and also a real wake-up call for Australia's relationships with Pacific Island countries. So a lot of questions have come out about, the depth, the resilience of Australia's relationships with Pacific Island countries. As I've said in my commentary, Australia's relationships with the Pacific are not fragile, but they certainly could be deeper and more comprehensive, and I'm very keen to explore that with you today.
And you do have two recent columns in the Australian Financial Review about the Solomon Islands. Look, given that Australia is a major aid donor in the region, how can its Pacific relationships ever truly be peer-to-peer? Aren't they doomed to be Australia as the big brother in the neighborhood, corralling its wayward children into doing its own bidding?
I think what it comes down to, and this is something that, over many years now, dozens, if not hundreds of academics and policymakers in Australia, New Zealand, and certainly across the Pacific have been calling out for, which is essentially a reset into a reset of Australia's perception of the Pacific. And truly acknowledging the sorts of messages that we've been hearing from the Pacific for decades with regards to that peer-to-peer status that you refer to. Now, the development program that Australia provides to the Pacific, that is one component of our bilateral relationships with the region, but that doesn't make a fully formed relationship. Pacific Island countries have been calling for everything from, a change in the tone and the tenor of rhetoric coming from Australian leaders, Australian commentators, policy analysts such as myself, everything down to calling for specific changes to barriers to people-to-people links in the region, barriers to further economic integration. These are things that encompass bilateral relations, between countries normally, where Australia has fallen short of in the Pacific. So speaking particularly there about economic ties and people-to-people ties.
Well, you're a former diplomat in the region. I mean, how do you compete, or how does Australia's current diplomats there, how do they compete with Chinese offers, which, China always makes it sound like it's friendship, it's elder brother adoption, comes with no strings attached. Now, I'm not sure that's actually true, but what is the on-the-ground competition like between Australian and Chinese diplomacy?
I think there are layers of sentiment across the Pacific, and of course, a huge diversity of perspectives. There are, almost 20 Pacific Island countries, each with their own particular historical, cultural, political, social identities, language groups. And Australia is generally, positively viewed in communities across the Pacific. We have very long-standing historical ties and a lot of great examples of positive contributions to regional peace and stability, positive contributions to people-to-people links. At the political level, it does tend to get a little bit more patchy, if you will. There are a lot of instances where the regional perception, as I understand it, has been that Australia has prioritized global or national interests above regional interests. Now, this might be specific to individual Pacific countries, but also divergences there with priorities that the region as a whole has articulated, including in conversations with Australia, Australia being a member of the Pacific Island Forum. So it is part of that conversation, but sometimes it is also separate to that conversation.
But are the countries in the region particularly interested in regional issues, or are they out for their own national gain?
Well, every country must, of course, prioritize its own prosperity. In the Pacific, there's an understanding that individual prosperity has to be a collective project. So the priorities that the Pacific Island countries have identified most recently and finally getting enough airtime is climate change and the impact that has on Pacific national security and human security. So looking there at impacts on individual communities, economies, contributing to drivers of instability and conflict. So, you know, just back to your earlier point about how does Australia compete? You know, in many ways, the countries in the Pacific and communities in the Pacific have been spelling it out for Australia for decades now. And really, the dynamic is more about this perception that Australia is keeping the Pacific at arm's length, at the same time looking to be connected on its own terms, during a crisis, a disaster response. So, a lot of dualities in Australia's posture. And I think Pacific Island countries' relationships with China, they're not setting out to replace Australia. The relationships that Pacific Island countries are pursuing with China are delivering for them. That's the perception, is they're delivering for those Pacific Island countries something that isn't typically part of their relationships with Australia. So looking there at trade and economic links.
Yeah, I'm curious about this difference in the way Australia and China do diplomacy in the region, because you emphasized with the Australia connection, people-to-people ties, and you've also emphasized holding countries at arm's length, which I think implies immigration issues, and there's certainly been no pressure in Australia not to have friendly relations with Pacific countries, whereas China seems to go straight to the top, right? Instead of looking, and actually China is generally unpopular in the countries that have joined its Belt and Road Initiative, but the projects it proposes benefit elites and benefit people who are connected with governments, maybe at the expense of their own people. Is that a fair characterization of the Australia-China competition in the region?
Look, it's a very broad way to look at it, but I'd say that it does broadly reflect the general trends that we're seeing, and this is part of the challenge before Australia right now. How does it gain or regain, depending on how well you thought it was going? How does it gain that influence that the Australian government is looking for in the Pacific? But even before we do that, we really need to understand, what do we mean by that influence? Do we mean Pacific Island governments being more receptive to Australian positions on international issues, more accepting of Australia's national position on things like climate change? Or do we mean that more organic influence that comes from, shared identities, shared cultural spaces? And when it comes to China's presence in the region, they're not looking for all of those same things themselves. As you say, China has been very effective at cultivating top-level political relationships. Community sentiment is certainly, I'd say more mixed or controversial with regards to China's more recent presence. I should also caveat, for this discussion, it is important to recognize that when we're talking about a Chinese presence in the Pacific, China, through waves of migration, generations of families have been present in the Pacific for over 100 years. So, there are also deep, long-standing ties there, and layers of families that would have, again, a very diverse sense of identity with respect to their Pacific Island country or their homeland in China, connections to Australia even. What we're really speaking about now, when we're focusing on geopolitics and this contest for influence, is this more recent push, that is either driven by Beijing, depending on your perspective, or at least in concert with Beijing's strategic ambitions for the region. So that's really what we're focusing on today. It's certainly not second guessing or challenging, the presence of Chinese migrants in the Pacific for over 100 years.
Right. But most of us here in Australia probably don't know that much about the Pacific. I didn't even know, you said there were how many countries in the Pacific region?
Well, a number of sort of subnational or not quite national entities. There is still the legacy of colonization and ongoing processes of decolonization, but we're looking at close to 20 Pacific Island nations.
So 20 or so, depending how you count. And if I don't even know how many countries there are, never mind naming them. I could name more countries in Africa than I could name countries in the Pacific. Is Australia's Pacific strategy really about engaging with the area, or is it really just about keeping China out?
Look, Australia's diplomatic presence and political and cultural connections with the Pacific predate the geopolitical tensions in the region by decades. We have shared histories going back before World War II and certainly since World War II. So I think it would be very unfair to frame the discussion in terms of Australia and China vying for influence in the Pacific, or frame Australia's presence in the Pacific as being a reaction to China. I think what we're seeing is an Australian policy reaction to an increasing Chinese official and economic and now security presence in the Pacific. But Australia has been present in the region. It is part of the region, and Australia has provided security assistance and development assistance for decades before this question of China's role in the region even came about.
Of course, for Australians, Australia is Australia. But for the Chinese leadership, Australia is often considered a kind of sub-hegemon or cat's paw, or I think the Chinese term is a running dog for the United States, whatever that actually is. I don't think anyone's ever been able to figure out that metaphor. Where does the U.S. fit in all this? In the Chinese picture of the Pacific, I think Australia is somehow subcontracted to manage the Pacific on behalf of the United States. But I take it for granted that that's not an accurate reflection of the true situation. But then what is the true situation of America's role in all this?
So, look, certainly it's part of Beijing's narrative to, as it undermines the rules-based order, it undermines Australia's independent foreign policy. Of course, Australia has extremely close cultural and security ties with the US. Australia supports the rules-based order, as articulated by a number of like-minded countries, and as it is present in the Pacific. Geography and history binds Australia to the Pacific, independently of its relationship with the US, and certainly independently of geopolitical ties. The US, it is also present in the Pacific, although that's very much a question that's part of the debate right now, is perceptions of absence of the US in parts of the Pacific, or historically more active and a more recent sort of benign neglect, if you will. This has prompted a reaction from the US in terms of Solomon Islands specifically. The US intends to establish an embassy in Honiara after an absence of some 30 years in the region. Of course, the Pacific was a theater of war in World War II, and Solomon Islands specifically was the site of many heated battles between Allied forces and the Japanese forces at the time. So the US is historically a part of the Pacific. It's not as visible, it's not as present today as countries like Australia and New Zealand. We might see something different in the future. Very happy to explore what that might look like as well. When it comes to questions of the rules-based order and the connection of regional security in the Pacific to global security, the US has to be a partner. It has to be a party to that discussion. It has to be an actor in the region. It is an actor in the region, and really the question there is what else? What in addition can the US and should the US be doing? But importantly, how does it increase its presence while fitting into existing regional architecture, existing regional definitions and conceptions of security. The Pacific hasn't been static since the US left parts of it. Regional security is a hot topic in the Pacific, has been a major topic of regional discussions. What we're seeing now is a need to better articulate regional security in light of increasing geopolitical competition around the globe, but now becoming more evident in the Pacific.
If we look beyond Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, which kind of form an outer rim of Australia's immediate environment, if you want to think of it that way, is there much going on that we should be aware of in the rest of the Pacific region? I mean, our news just doesn't seem to report Pacific issues. We occasionally hear about Fiji in the news, but only if there's some kind of political problem there, and the rest of the Pacific almost seems not to exist in the Australian news. We hear much more about Ukraine, which is so much farther away than we do about anything going on in the Pacific. Is there anything on your radar screen for the wider Pacific region?
Well, look, this is at the heart of the discussion now when we're talking about regional security and resetting of relationships between traditional partners in light of new partners. The Pacific very much exists every day of the year, every hour of the day, and so on. And while mainstream media in countries like Australia or the US doesn't cover the Pacific extensively on a day-to-day basis, as has been said by many other commentators and people that have dedicated their careers, if not their lives, to improving regional security and relationships between Australia and the Pacific is very much aware of what's going on in the rest of the world. Part of the challenge before Australia today is how do we build that, other academics have said, that Pacific literacy within Australia and by extension, other like-minded countries. These countries are there every day, whether or not we're reporting on them, and things are happening. And what we're seeing with China's increased presence in the region is that it's not only the sort of the hard security elements of stability and political conflict in the Pacific that affect the national security of Australia, but also their prosperity. They're building closer ties with China because that is perceived as an opportunity to access markets, trade, commerce, to access economic independence, something that the Australian aid program cannot possibly provide and shouldn't be tasked to do so. How do we build that more organic awareness and understanding of the Pacific?
Well, I mean, why? Let me push back on that a little bit. Why shouldn't an aid program be tasked with helping promote economic independence? I mean, after all, teach a man to fish. Shouldn't we be teaching the poorer countries of the Pacific Islands how to fend for themselves?
Well, look, of course, and I'm speaking in in very broad terms. The aid program does have, economic development activities. What I'm speaking to is really that actual trade and the economic independence that comes from the free flow of business and labor and people. So the economic program certainly does focus. There are technical programs to do with agriculture, governance programs, business assistance programs, all of these technical solutions. But I'm speaking there really about the free flow of capital and people and genuine commercial business activities that can contribute to Pacific nations' incomes in a direct and immediate way.
But it seems that, I should be much more familiar with the programs. My understanding is that there are actually work programs in Australia for at least some of the Pacific Island states, whereas in China, the activity seems to be the opposite direction of Chinese nationals going to the Pacific Islands to do business as opposed to providing jobs offshore. I doubt many Pacific Islanders get work visas to China. Isn't Australia already doing a lot in that space?
I think so. China's economic activity in the Pacific, it's really around that resource extraction and the construction of infrastructure. So the majority of minerals, logs, fisheries, resources from the Pacific are sold to China. So there's income from selling those things. And then the other economic, more visible economic activity is the construction of infrastructure. And you're right that typically Chinese workers will get flown in to construct those projects. And the intention, at least on paper, is that those projects, in building that infrastructure, that will then facilitate economic activity. And infrastructure is vitally important for every region, for every country, not just the Pacific. So that is important that it continues to happen. Many people have been advocating for Australia, like-minded countries, the US, Japan, to be more active in that infrastructure space. But there are questions around, the bankability of projects. So it is a complicated space to be in. To speak to your point about what Australia is doing in terms of those economic links, there is a Pacific labour scheme, and that's intended to provide access to Pacific workers on a short-term basis for key tasks. So typically in agriculture. Your question is, isn't Australia doing a lot? I think the answer throughout the Pacific and from other Pacific analysts would be not really. In terms of the scale and the quantum of that activity, right. It is the right sort of activity, but it's not sufficient to turn around, the economic destiny of a country. The debate.
Australia is certainly doing more than any other country is, right?
Well, sure. And we are part of the Pacific. Australia is the biggest, closest labor market or labor destination for the Pacific, potentially. And it comes down to the barriers that Australia has in place. So we have seen proposals, both for the result of a parliamentary inquiry into how Australia can build better relationships with the Pacific. And we've seen, Australia's undergoing a national election, which will be resolved later this week. One of the proposals on the table by the Labor Party is to increase the scope of that labour access and to introduce a migration pathway dedicated to the Pacific. So this speaks to the volume question, but also it broadens that economic activity beyond that seasonal labour activity into other sectors of the economy.
Right, though that would have the potential to simply hollow out Pacific Islands as the young and able-bodied come to work in Australia, depriving their own countries of the use of their labor.
It's certainly a very, very challenging sort of flow to calibrate. What it does have is the immediate effect of increased remittances that would be sent back to Pacific Island countries. So you have that immediate economic contribution. Over time, of course, it can't just be opening up Australia's labour market and having the most able-bodied and well-skilled Pacific Islanders coming and working in Australia, and that be the end of the story. Of course, it does need to be balanced by skills and training in the Pacific, and this idea that people can contribute in Australia and then can also contribute back in their own economy. So it does need to be a sustainable flow back and forth.
Now, we'll be wrapping up soon, but I did want to ask you and to return to the China security issue. And I wanted to ask you, does China have any, let's say, legitimate security interests in the region? I mean, considering that China is building infrastructure, that China does have a lot of nationals in the region, doesn't that create a legitimate purpose for China to have a security presence in the region? And I'll piggyback on that. Our viewer Anthony asks, is China seeking to displace Australia as the regional hegemon in order to control the trade routes through the Pacific?
I think, in facilitating increased migration and economic flows into the Pacific, China finds itself with an obligation to protect those projects and even to provide security assistance to Chinese communities in the Pacific. So, it's very difficult to untangle that. What analysts who are more skeptical of China's global ambitions are also looking at is, what is the strategic dividend you have most recent example of unrest in Honiara. The original primary target of a demonstration was Prime Minister Manasseh Sogavare and the parliament in Honiara. But the next easiest target was Honiara's Chinatown district, which is typically targeted in bouts of unrest. And so you're looking there at security concerns of Chinese nationals and Chinese Solomon Islanders. So, Australia, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, and Fiji mobilized very quickly to provide security stabilization assistance, including providing protection to all of those threatened communities. But China would have that obligation to provide that as well. So it's about calibrating what that presence looks like. And if we're talking about a non-transparent security agreement that facilitates rotations of soldiers and access to resupply ships, how does that contribute to the domestic security concerns of Honiara and regional security needs?
Well, we could imagine the uproar in Australia and the West more broadly had China sent peacekeeping troops to restore order. But I mean, I'm playing the skeptic here a bit, but I mean, wouldn't they have every interest and potentially every right to send those troops?
Well, ultimately, the question only comes down to the sovereign government. So Prime Minister Sogavare, it's really up to him and his government to decide who is allowed to send an external security presence to the country.
But had he invited in Chinese troops, I mean, Australia certainly would not have been happy about that.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of questions there about the public order management of Chinese police forces versus the decades-long security cooperation that Australia and the rest of the region has been providing to Solomon Islands and to other crises in the region. And we're talking there about different kinds of policing. And for the region, I think getting a dose of Chinese public order management practices would be something very new and I would say very concerning for them.
Now we have to wrap up. I do have one final viewer question. And it's a tough one. That is, should there be an Australian Monroe Doctrine style hegemony over the Pacific?
I think, we don't want to automatically superimpose Australia's strategic needs and interests onto the region. Any new regional security agreement or settlement has to come from the region itself. Australia is a part of that conversation, but it's not the only voice in that conversation. So, what I expect to see is that in coming months, forums like the Pacific Island Forum, where all Pacific countries come to, they are in a position to articulate and agree on what kind of security architecture, what kind of security arrangements works best for the region. We can't automatically assume that just as a Chinese base is, concerning to the region, that contrariwise an Australian base would be welcome. And in fact, the opposite, which is why you don't have Australian bases littered throughout the Pacific. It's not something that the region has asked for. When they talk about regional security, they have other things on their mind: climate change, fisheries, economics, livelihoods, youth bulge, and so on. And so whatever arrangement Australia comes to with the region, it has to be led by the region.
Mihai Sora, thank you for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks also to our producer, Nico Mallion. The director of the Center for Independent Studies is Tom Switzer. I'm Salvatore Babonis. Thank you for watching On Liberty.